This is Ray Stokes in the oral history section of the library of the Texas College of Osteopathic Medicine on March 9th, 1983. I'm delighted to have in my office today for an interview with Dr. C.C. Jitter Nolen, former president of the North Texas State University and Texas College of Osteopathic Medicine. Dr. Nolen is a former Vice Chancellor for Development for the Texas Christian University here in Fort Worth. And Dr. Nolen is now Vice President for Development of the Oklahoma Medical Research Foundation. It's a pleasure to visit with you today and to renew acquaintances. I'm going to call you Jitter. I know you that well. I want to just do a little roundup of one or two questions here. One might lead into another, and I'd like you to just feel free to discuss anything that comes to mind. As the Chief Executive Officer of NTSU, when TCOM became a part of the university system through legislative action, you became head, naturally, of TCOM as well. Do you recall your first introduction to the Young Osteopathic Med School in Fort Worth, and what or who was your particular entree?
Ray, I recall the introduction to the Osteopathic Medical School quite well. Mm-hmm. It came early in my tenure as president of North Texas, and in fact occurred within a few days after my inauguration early in December of 1971. Mm-hmm. In the inauguration address, I said something about North Texas not being equipped to be all things to all persons, especially in the Metroplex area, but it was clear that we had the resources to be more service to more persons than we were doing at that time. Shortly after that, I received a phone call from one of the senior professors on the campus, Dr. J.K.G. Sylvie, Gwen
yes,
Sylvie.
I've already had an interview with Dr. Sylvie.
I'd like to hear that one sometime. It ought to be good.
Yeah.
Dr. Sylvie, as you know, was and is a fine, outstanding freshwater biologist. He asked if I meant what I said in those remarks. Not knowing what he had in mind, I said, of course I meant what I said. And he was speaking to the part about more things to more people. Mm-hmm. He said, I believe there's a group in Fort Worth that we can help if you're willing to explore it. I said, what is that? He said, are you familiar with the Texas College of Osteopathic Medicine? And I said, yes, I knew that it was in existence. I had learned about it when I was in Fort Worth at TCU because Dr. Henry Hart, a very well-known chemist from TCU, was serving as the first dean or the first chief executive officer, as you well know, of TCOM. And I had learned that at TCU, in my time at TCU. So Dr. Sylvie simply asked, would I be willing to explore further conversation? And I said, of course. So that was in December, and I had just come to North Texas in August. So it was quite early, you see, that I was introduced to the idea. Mm-hmm. Following that, Dr. Sylvie carried the word back to Dr. George Louisville that North Texas is willing to enter discussions about some possibility of service in some form or fashion, probably in the teaching area. I just knew that there was such thing as an osteopathic medical school, but I, at that time, was not sure of the differences between allopathic medicine and osteopathic medicine. I'm not certain that I'm sure of the differences today, as a matter of fact, but I surely wasn't then. So I called the local osteopathic clinic in Denton.
Mhm.
Dr. Bob Noble
Yeah,
said,
Bob
sure,
Noble.
come on out. He'd be glad to show me around. I told him I wanted to know more about osteopathic medicine. So during the Christmas holidays, during the break, I asked Dr. Puree, who was the academic vice president, to go with me, and we visited with Dr. Noble, went through his clinic. He has a small number of beds up there, and discussed the philosophy of osteopathic medicine, and received 3 or 4 small booklets and one hardback volume about osteopathic medicine.
Mhm.
So this is a long way of being introduced to the idea, but
Right.
it nevertheless was a thorough introduction. Following that, Dr. Lubel arranged for a small gathering at Colonial Country Club down here in either late December or early January. There were 12 or 15 persons present, including, I think, the 3 founders of the
Mhm.
school, Dr. Lubel, Dr. Carl Everett, Dr. Danny Byron,
Right, right.
were there, and some others, some officers from the state association. And Dr. Lubel explained, Dr. Hart explained that TCOM could use some assistance as far as teaching some of the basic sciences. They were trying to expand, but couldn't expand rapidly enough with their small faculty to tackle a larger entering class, which they wanted to do. So, trying to be of service to more persons, we agreed to look at it, and Dr. Frey proceeded to check with the deans and some of the department heads about whether or not this was feasible. Following that, there was a social occasion over in Dallas, and I met Dr. Bob Sharp,
Mhm. Yeah.
who was married to one of my favorite cousins, and I didn't even know it at the time. Lovely gal, Margie. And so I then had an entree with a member of the family
Right.
that I could speak to informally
I
about
had
the
forgotten
nature.
that you were a cousin of Margie.
That's right. And I could speak informally then with a member of the family about this business of osteopathic medicine. So following that then, one thing led to another, and we worked out, as you know, an official contract to teach certain basic sciences on the North Texas campus in our biology and chemistry departments primarily, and it was simply a very simple contract, and it was to be compensated for almost on a per student basis. We tried to find something where that the school could afford and that North Texas could afford to provide the services for. We also agreed in 1973 to join TCOM politically in seeking state funds to fund that private teaching arrangement with North Texas,
Right.
because Baylor College of Medicine was private medical school and was receiving a subsidy, so we felt that TCOM deserved the same treatment. So that was our first approach jointly to the legislature, was in 73 to try to secure funds to provide that teaching service. And that then led to the later political involvement. But that basically was my entree, and I still recall it very well.
Thank you, Jitter. I remember and I recall while you were discussing that, I think it was in August 1972, we had our first joint meeting of the Board of Regents, who were hosts at a luncheon that we had our Board of Directors meeting there on the North Texas campus.
That's right. If that occurred, and you would recall this better than I would.
That was just before we started our fall campaign in late August 1972.
That's right. As well as I recall, the board had agreed to the contract prior to that time, although some of the board members knew a lot less about the philosophy of osteopathic medicine than either Dr. Foray or I did at that time.
Well, you had a good rapport with Dr. Lubel, and of course, did you know Dr. Lubel prior to your checking into the possibilities with the
No,
school?
I did not, but it did not take me long to learn that he had been the family physician of my family in Ferris, Texas. And when I learned that he had actually removed Aunt Myrtle's gallbladder,
Yeah.
then immediately we became
Right.
family as well as friends. And when I talked with the family in Ferris, because that was my favorite place to visit in the summer growing up, and that branch of the Nolen family was there for 3 generations, and Dr. Lubel was the family physician. And so I immediately developed great trust and respect, not only for Dr. Lubel professionally, but he seemed to be a very old and longtime family friend.
Right.
So it made it easier for us to talk together and to understand one another.
That's understandable. Going along a little further here, Jitter, do you recall any particular resistance, either from the NTSU faculty and or the Board of Regents? There was a stumbling block, and any thoughts on just the object, any that might be stepping stones?
Well, not stumbling blocks so much. When we talked together in '73 and were successful in securing some funds
Right.
for TCOM
Right.
on a per capita basis, it was a token amount, but it was enough to pay for the teaching services at North Texas. That, of course, opened the door to the question of whether consolidation indeed was something that ought to be considered. And as you know, that bill later on was introduced in '75 and was passed.
Right.
And even though in your opening question you said something about when TCOM became a part of the university system, part of the problem from the beginning was that there was no system.
I see.
The bill did not spell out that there was a system, and actually it stated, as well as I recall, that the chief executive officer of North Texas would serve also as president or chief executive officer of TCOM.
Mm-hmm.
That meant then that there were 2 streams of administration emanating from the office of the president at North Texas, and that caused some confusion and was the main stumbling block, I think, because we were unable to structure the consolidation properly at first. We had to live with the wording as the statute was written and as it was revised slightly, and there was some resistance both within the ranks of the osteopaths in Texas.
Right.
There was, of course, some resistance on the part of the faculty at North Texas. Some members felt that this would drain resources from North Texas. There was some resistance within the board itself, mainly because some board members, when they would return to their hometown and seek advice about a medical school, invariably did not find a DO to advise with. They knew only MDs.
Mm-hmm.
And as you know, you can get a fairly biased view quickly from the average MD.
Right.
And some of our board members receive that kind of biased information. And so some splits developed and some questions developed early and at practically every level. The administration was strongly supportive of the idea. It made sense to teach basic sciences out of strong basic science departments that were already in existence at North Texas. But once the PhDs who were teaching the basic sciences discovered the salary differential between the average DO faculty member and the PhD basic science teacher, they requested additional funding for their teaching efforts. And once that occurred, then the PhDs who were teaching the chemistry majors at North Texas wondered why they didn't also receive a salary increase, and so that set in motion some other roadblocks. Now there were some stepping stones, as you say, because in the early days we didn't have many models to go by. The Michigan State experience was about the only one in the
Right.
country that we could pattern after. And we soon learned that we did not want to do it like Michigan State. Probably a variation on that theme would have been better. And as you know, they're dealing with 3 medical expressions up there, not just 2, as we were. We felt it would be a stepping stone for North Texas into the Fort Worth area because we were concerned about the growth of UT at Arlington. We knew we would have the fashion department to help us with a stepping stone or a window into Dallas.
Mm-hmm.
And we knew that if North Texas did not fill this vacuum in Tarrant County and in Dallas County, indeed UT Arlington or some other university would come along and do that. That's the main reason why it was a big plus as far as I was concerned for the long-term well-being of North Texas. I think we all knew that as soon as we had funding and as soon as we had facilities, that the teaching effort would have to be confined to Fort Worth and not remain on the North Texas campus. But by the time that came along, we found some faculty members were trying to keep the teaching effort in Denton for the basic sciences because they wanted their cake and they wanted to eat it too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So there were some difficulties, but these were overcome, I think, by and large in the early days, except for the fact that we were unable to get a DO appointed to our Board of Regents. And without having Dr. Lubel or Dr. Everett or Dr. Byard, one of the 3 founders, probably, or some other DO that had the trust and confidence of the governor at that time, it simply left the administration in the position of constantly explaining, constantly requesting, and constantly confronting the board with one question after another about this strange new program that was growing much faster than any other graduate program at North Texas because the state of Texas recognized the need for family physicians and they were willing to fund it.
Right.
And so the funding came and the growth came, and it was simply too large a bite for North Texas to be able to consume in that short a time frame, I believe. And so then some splits developed on the board concerning the location of the school. There again, the board was inclined to receive advice from many other persons
Right.
outside of the DO community. And about that same time, some splits, I believe, developed in the political leadership within the Osteopathic Association within Texas itself, and some of the newer members of the profession, because there was something interesting and there was something worth working for, instead of letting the old-timers do the work, as had been the case in years past. Dr. Lubel became national president
Right.
out of all this and deserved that recognition. But when some of the younger leadership decided they wanted in on the act over in Fort Worth, then we simply had split opinions developing all across the board from 75 on, and 77 was a particularly difficult time in the legislature, although we were successful in getting the funding still, but we couldn't agree internally, for instance, on whether or not the school itself was indeed to remain in its present location, and that led to some other concerns. Fortunately for everyone concerned, it was agreed that the school remained where it is. Funding later came along. The property was bought, and now you see these fine structures here today and in a part of town where it probably belongs.
In September 1973, Jitter, some 2 years before TCOM became part of the state system, part under North Texas, a Mr. Jack Robeson appeared on the scene here at TCOM. Will you identify him and sort of explain his role in the physical affairs of TCOM?
Well, Jack was asked to serve as liaison with TCOM, between TCOM and North Texas, out of the business office. He had been controller at North Texas. He had been business manager and was then made into some kind of special assistant to John Carter, who was the vice president for business affairs. And because we had the contract, which began in the fall of 73, I suppose. Did the contract begin in 73 or 72?
It began in 72.
Okay, then we operated for a year without the state funding for it. Because of that contract, and because we had received the state funding in the spring of 73, the state auditor wanted us to monitor that more closely than we felt we could, simply out of the office, and so we relieved Jack of enough time to physically come here. As well as I recall, the first request for his services was for 1 day a week, and that soon turned into 2 and 3,
Right.
because of the lack of experience totally on the part of a private medical school for relating to the way the state of Texas required certain things to be done. And so Jack was asked to serve in this liaison capacity, and did so for 2 or 3 years. In 75, of course, we needed, because it was then fully funded by the state, and instead of, the budget quadrupled, the capital funding came in millions of dollars. It was just more money than the private TCOM had seen in its total life up until that point.
Right.
And when you can recall that we're sitting on the site today of where once stood a noble bowling alley,
Right.
and not too many years ago, it's you can see that this was a quantum leap, and so we had to go in for stronger and more stringent fiscal oversight, simply because of the lack of experience in a private school. But that's the only reason that Jack was asked to do that, and he was the highest level business office type person that was available for this assignment.
I believe Jack and both Mr. Carter are both retired now, aren't they?
I understand that. I've not seen either one lately. I know that John, of course, came back later, served as pardon me, as acting president.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think he retired shortly after that.
I understand Jack had a very, very bad heart attack.
Oh, is that right?
About 2 years ago.
I had not heard that. I knew that he was always fighting an ulcer, and I remember when he tried, I had an ulcer also, and Dr. Lubel showed me one day in his office how I could relieve that pain with a manipulative technique, and I don't think I've taken any Donatol since that time.
Is it?
And I've had some ulcer treatments by some of the best.
Yeah, you're exposed to the ulcer environment.
Marion Coy gave me one up in
Right.
the office of the president in Denton one day when I was.
Well, when you refer to Marion Coy, you're referring to the founding president.
That
of
is
TCOM.
correct. The founding president himself, the great Harshman.
That's right. Yeah, he's still with the
I
college.
bet he
in a
is.
restricted way.
I'll
but
bet you he can still do manipulative technique
he's
as well
still
as
with that department.
anybody in
He's
school.
He's certainly a master at it.
Good.
In the same vein, would you share some of the reasons that led you to select Dr. Gus Puree as interim vice president of medical affairs shortly after the transfer from private to public institution took place in September of 75?
Well, just as we needed fiscal oversight when we became affiliated with TCOM, when North Texas became affiliated in a full and direct sense, and it came together in my office, and there was no other room for any in-between analysis or interpretation. I was left with the option as president of depending entirely on the dean from TCOM and recommendations that he might forward, because we were required by state law to prepare 2 separate agendas and to actually act in 2 different orders of business within the Board of Regents. So we had to close one out, the North Texas agenda, open the TCOM agenda, and then sometimes we had to close it out and go back to North Texas in order to accomplish certain things within the right time sequence. Because we wanted to make very sure of the academic credibility being maintained, so we felt we had a stronger than usual stake in this because we had been teaching by contract since 1972. In order to broaden the base and see if there were other areas besides simply the basic sciences where we could perform university or academic functions in a cost-effective manner, I felt the need for one of the highest level academicians that I could find. And Dr. Puree was willing to do this. It was easier to find someone who could perform the functions of Dr. Puree at North Texas than it was for me to find someone whom I knew and understood that had come up through a university side of the ledger to give the academic and the non-academic but non-fiscal oversight that I felt was needed there.
Right.
We had a new dean, and in order to be sure that we were developing our own model and not, what shall I say, copying Michigan State,
Right.
I asked Dr. Puree to fill this role, and he agreed to do that. And so I did it with the highest level person that I could find that I thought had the qualities to fill that assignment.
Jitter, do you recall, when we became part of the university and had a joint meeting between the board of directors, which was their last meeting,
Right.
And the board of regents, and it was a very hot day in the
Yes.
last day or so of August 1975, right over out here on the street of Clifton.
That's right.
Between just this side of the, which at that time was our outpatient clinic.
That's
it's now
right.
the office of the Tarrant County Medical Examiner.
That's right.
But I think the college still owns that property. It's leased out to the medical examiner. But I know I had something to do with arrangements that day, and we had chairs out there, and it was a hot. Do you recall anything that you feel that you could share that might have occurred? I know we had the meeting. We started there and had the ribbon cutting and et cetera, an exchange of papers between Dr. Lubel and Mr. Willis, who was a chairman
of the board
at that time. Right. And then they had a joint meeting up at the Fort Worth Osteopathic Hospital.
That's right.
And then shared a lunch together. Did anything occur at that time during the meeting that is memorable to you in any way?
Well, you'll have to refresh my thinking a little bit. We were in a rush that day trying to get from one place to another and going through the process. My recollection, and it's just a recollection and not specific, is that Drs. Lubel, Everett, and Beyer were delighted that this had finally come off. It was almost like a proud set of fathers watching their oldest son go off to college and graduate from high school.
Right.
Sort of like a
good comparison.
A bridge had been crossed, a dream had come true, and that now that state funding was assured, then the fate of the future of the college was assured.
Right.
And this pleased the founders very much because they had struggled through some very lean years.
Right.
And had given unstintingly of their time and their money and their energies. You could just see, the late hours that went into all this, trying to figure out where to get next month's payroll.
Right.
And yet they were still getting good students and turning out a good product because of the zeal of the average osteopathic physician to pass on what he knew. And so you had some very fine teaching, I think, in those early days. I do remember it being hot.
Extremely hot.
Yes,
Really
and
hot.
I remember that what was left of that bowling alley wasn't too well air conditioned at that time.
Right.
I'm not sure I recall anything else that occurred. I did become painfully aware at that time that the chairman of our board, Mr. Willis, was indeed the son of an MD in Richmond, Virginia. His father had founded and for many years had served a very well-known clinic. I forget the last name. It was the Willis something clinic in Richmond. Apparently was a very fine physician. And even though Chairman Willis understood what we were doing and knew the need for North Texas to have a window in to Fort Worth, I think even at that meeting it was clear that some of our regents, even though the bill had been signed, still did not understand fully what had taken place as far as that kind of collaborative effort. Questions were still being raised, and I guess this was a little bit of a case of legislation taking place when it had to take place, whether or not either board was fully prepared for that legislation to come about. I suspect that the TCOM board was more prepared, although I remember some marks by Dr. Can't think of his name, the man from Corpus Christi.
Sam Gans?
Sam Gans.
Right.
Who was still openly, outwardly very suspicious of anything in the state of Texas bureaucracy.
Mm-hmm.
And since North Texas State University was a part of the bureaucracy of the state of Texas, he was suspicious of that. And that was voiced even at that meeting, whereupon some of our board members voiced some of their concerns right back at Dr. Gans.
I believe he was president of the Texas Osteopathic.
He was either president or he was incoming president. He was a leader at the top. The one the year before who had a completely different opinion was Dr. Calabrese.
Right, Mike Calabrese from El Paso.
From El Paso,
right.
Who approved this. But you see there again, one of the factors that has always occurred in this is this changeover of leadership at the state level, which impacted the direction of TCOM. It was not, at that time, completely autonomous. It was on paper, but I don't think he was emotionally from the state association, because for years the state association had fought to have a medical school.
Right.
So I don't know. Is there anything else that if you can refresh my memory, maybe I can.
No, I can't think of anything. I just remembered that was seemingly, and I'm just was an observer more than anything else, but there seemed to be quite a restraint or at the meeting.
Oh, I think there was. I think there again, it was our board wasn't certain. What do we do with this now? It just wasn't the normal graduate program like adding a PhD in math.
Right.
Where you can call in one person, the head of the department or your senior faculty member, and he will explain how great this PhD is going to be and what it will mean for the quality of life in the world, and you go on about your business. This was a huge program with a large budget and a lot of students, and a program that was relying on medical skills and practices that had occurred 100 years ago and were being brought up to date in modern fashion, and new osteopathic schools were coming into being all over the country. It was an idea whose time had come.
Right.
But I'm not sure that our regents were prepared for this particular time. Right. Now, with all due respect to our board, they voted right down the line for everything that took place and did their best, I think, to cope with it. And as you recall, out of that meeting, Chairman Willis assigned 2 or 3 persons. I believe it was Bill Jamar from Brownwood and Hugh Wolf from Stephenville,
right,
to be liaison And later I think this was interpreted to mean just Regent Wolf by and large, not a committee, but one regent to act as liaison for TCOM in order to give TCOM a voice. But I imagine it took Mr. Wolf and Mr. Jamar 2 or 3 years to begin to get a feel for the differences between osteopathic medicine and allopathic medicine, and why the state of Texas should be funding this program at all, and why some things couldn't be done by, for, or at North Texas, and had to be done by osteopaths for osteopaths in an osteopathic vein. The only other thing, now that you mentioned that a little bit about the restraint, the only other thing that I recall that might have occurred was the fact that the North Texas Board chose to go into an executive session at that time, which confused some of the visiting TCOM board members, because they suddenly felt left out, and it dawned on them that it dawned on them in a very visible fashion that they no longer had any official responsibility or control or authority over the affairs of, quote, their medical school.
Right.
And that was one thing that occurred that probably I've heard references to that since then. I don't know how that could have been handled any differently, because it was necessary for North Texas to discuss some budgetary matters and out of the glare of the press. And the only way to do that was to go into executive session. So I don't know how it could have been done otherwise, unless we had foreseen that and actually had served notice perhaps to those attending in a different fashion, or indeed if we had left the TCOM campus and gone to another site and continued the meeting, rather than asking the doctors to leave their own room over in the osteopathic hospital, which may have in a way been a way of not getting off on the right foot. I don't know. But I think the Regents were by and large open and above board in both their concerns and in their willingness to vote as they saw the needs of the state of Texas being met later on. But there again, I believe the board at North Texas has always been lacking a knowledgeable DO representative, whether indeed it is a DO physician, or whether it's the wife of a DO, or whether it's a nurse who has served in a DO hospital. There are many other kinds of persons besides a licensed DO that it could have been selected by the governor, so that the DOs would feel that they had a sympathetic voice on the board. And so far as I know, and I've been away from it now for 4 years, almost 4 years, so far as I know, that has never been done. And as long as you do not have, see, the University of Texas board usually has both an MD, at least one, and usually a dentist. And they take it upon themselves to both criticize and protect the dental school and the MD school. But at least you have a professional person who understands the needs and the aspirations of that particular branch. You get many more attorneys appointed to boards than you do other persons. And North Texas has other areas represented. One of the ladies who's a regent, Mrs. Murkison, has a strong interest and great knowledge of the fashion industry, so she represents Dallas in the fashion program over there very well, I would imagine. I don't know her and have not seen her in action, but I think that is still, I suspect that that's still a matter of concern today.
I'm sure it is. In the fall of 1976, Jitter, we received word that a Mr. L.L. LaRue would assume command of TCOM's fiscal affairs. Can you discuss what you can about his background and why he was selected as the chief fiscal officer at that time?
Well, Ray, as you know, by the time the appropriation came in 75 and we began spending the appropriation in the in the fall of '75. By 1976, early in the spring, in fact, shortly after the February meeting, which I think was held down here, we knew we needed full-time fiscal supervision. The budget was just too large to be handled by those that were already on board. And Mr. Robeson had exhausted the time he could spend, and we had asked him if he would like to do this, and he said no. He did not want to move from Denton, and we didn't feel that you could commute and do this. We knew someone would have to come down here. We were looking then for someone to come to Fort Worth and do this who had previous knowledge of the state method of doing things. Mr. LaRue had just retired from Texas Woman's University and was willing to look at another state situation. And I think there were one or two other names that were available. Most of the people that we wanted to move from some of the medical school areas were not acceptable either to TCOM because they had been at the wrong kind of medical school. Although I felt at the time that we needed someone really who was knowledgeable about a medical school, whether it was allopathic or osteopathic, because I felt that the fiscal principles were the same regardless of the philosophy of medicine that was practiced. But we were unable to find a person in the usual places. I know we were interviewing one person up at Midwestern University, and he chose not to continue to look at the job. As well as I recall, we came down to just two candidates for this. One had been at Texas A&M. Mr. LaRue knew his way around Austin, and we thought that he could be helpful in the lobbying efforts.
And he had an excellent entree into the legislative budget board, I'm sure.
He sure did, and knew exactly what had to be done and the cycle. As you know, there are many deadlines that you don't find written down on paper in the state system of reporting and the financial affairs, the coordinating board, just the whole range. And he knew his way through this. And so this is the one that Dean Willard selected from those two candidates as being the best qualified person available at that time. Now, there again, I think it was it would have been desirable to find someone who understood medical education. And even though Mr. LaRue had been at TWU, where they had nursing education, as you know, sometimes the lack of understanding on the part of doctors for nurses and on the part of nurses for doctors is about as vast as the difference between some of the sciences within arts and sciences and the basic sciences as seen through the eyes of a DO. So it would have been desirable, but there simply was not anyone available from that source. And so there again, Mr. LaRue was selected, and I approved the dean's choice at that point.
Good. In that same vein, can you add any information to his leave of absence that was given in May 1978? It kind of hit everybody here at the time as somewhat of a shock.
LaRue?
Yes.
As well as I recall, that was tied up, and I can't think of his last name, the associate dean that later left, the pediatrician that went back to Kirksville. Charles,
and it starts with a K. Klein? No.
Klein.
Klein.
Chuck Klein.
Klein.
Yes,
Klein.
of course, Chuck Klein, right.
Klein.
I do know that that Dr. Klein and some other of the department heads at that time felt that the business office, and I don't think it was a concern about Mr. LaRue personally so much as it was an irritation, at least, with the requirements of the state of Texas. I grew up with those. My first job with the University of Texas was as a student when I was in the motor pool at the University of Texas and had to fill out certain forms every week, and they were unlike anybody else's farms in the whole world. And we were required to do some things, mainly because of riders on the appropriation bill, and they just grow up over a period of time. Sometimes there's no rhyme or reason for them, but this was not understood or accepted by many of the DO faculty members, especially when they came in from out of state. And of course we had to get many from out of state, as we had to get Dr. Klein from out of state, because that's where the trained faculty members were. And you need that new blood from out of state in order to have a valid faculty. So I don't recall the specifics, but I do know there was a great deal of pressure raised about the workings of the business office. My impression is that Mr. LaRue was a stickler for the rules as put out by the state of Texas, and some of the personnel at TCOM took issue with this, and so usually someone gets caught in the middle. So it could have been a combination of Mr. LaRue wanting out from under some of the pressure, and Dean Willard trying to ease the pressure that he saw mounting on some of the faculty members. And you try to avoid those either-or situations if you can, and so one thing led to another, and it seemed expedient, I suppose would be the best word at that time, for Mr. LaRue to take a leave of absence. I don't remember many of the specifics about it, because again, I have not referred to these files. As a matter of fact, I don't think I have these files intact. I moved from Denton to Fort Worth after leaving there in the spring of '79, and then moved to Oklahoma City in February of 1980. Went by the wayside.
Well, I appreciate your sharing that information, Jitter. And in conclusion, would you summarize your highlight memories of your association with TCOM, its administration, its faculty, and its students? I know that's quite a statement, but just a...
Well, you have to realize that when you've been an enlisted man and a pharmacist mate in the United States Navy, and then to sit on the same stage in academic regalia with a graduating class of osteopathic physicians, you have to realize that you've come about as far as an ex-pharmacist mate can come. I wasn't particularly aware during the war, World War II that is, of the difference between a DO and an MD. But I did run into that in my Naval Reserve career, and as a matter of fact, my last Navy Reserve physical that I had was given to me by a DO who had made captain, and there are not very many captain DOs in the Navy, I'll tell you. So I had learned to respect the profession somewhat, even though I didn't know the differences then, and discovered really indeed there are very few differences. But the thing I learned to appreciate most, especially being around men like Dr. Lubel, Dr. Everett, Dr. Byer, Dr. Calabrese, some of the others across the state, was this tremendous dedication to furthering the quality within the profession. Just if it is true that you find your life by losing it, then some of the DOs I have known have found their life more fully than most people, because they serve that profession well. I was struck also by by the wives who were equally as dedicated. A lot of DO, husband and wife DO teams. Just complete dedication to the profession. Now I realize it's a minority profession, and like the geologists, they have to stick together in order to survive, perhaps. But still, I was struck by that, and I was very proud that the state of Texas agreed with our request to fund this the way it should be funded and help lift it out of the minority position here. The other thing that struck me was the total unselfishness. I've been around physicians, both in the Navy and out, before, and maybe go ahead. The unselfishness goes far beyond just serving patients, and when the three founders so unselfishly gave the results of their work to the state of Texas, and the state association joined in that, that's what makes the quality of life better, and what gives all of us inspiration to be better human beings than we are. You're around some beautiful human beings, and I cherish that. And then to see the first graduating class, and to know that they've gone out to the small towns in Texas and taken up family practice because they're willing to serve the underserved sick people of the state, you know that you're doing something good for the state of Texas as well. And I took some pride in being able to share in that. By and large, I think the city of Fort Worth has not understood or accepted this valuable resource. They may now. Again, I've been away for 4 years and I don't know. But I do know that at that time, some of the powers that be in Fort Worth were not sure that they wanted this school to grow in the fashion that it had, because, again, they didn't know what kind of school it was.
Right.
And yet it serves the most noble purpose of all. And therefore is not just another professional school added to an already good university, but it indeed is a profession that can stand by itself and deserves to be treated by itself, though I still feel that there's much to be gained by collaboration and cooperation and certain kinds of coordination, although I doubt if you can ever do this really without harming the autonomy of TCOM. I imagine that from time to time requests will come up for separate status and so on. I still think that would be an error, because I think in unity and in some kind of combination there's greater strength than being alone. But that's my own opinion, and it comes from a university opinion, although I think I always tried to serve the president's role, and I think I was able to wear separate but equal hats when the occasion called for it. But I took great pride in being associated with TCOM, and still do.
Dr. Nolen, the oral history section of the library here at TCOM is certainly indebted to you for sharing your memoirs with the department. We're grateful for the effort that you've made. We appreciate it very much. And this is Ray Stokes in the oral history section of the library at TCOM on the 9th day of this is March. I've lost about 2 months. 9th day of March, 1983. Thank you very kindly, Dr. Nolen.
You're welcome, Ray.